For 14 months, the best neurological minds in 3 states had looked at Margit Solis' chart and seen what they expected to find. 14 months of specialists, of assessments, of the careful, authoritative language of limitation. Then a charge nurse on the neurorehabilitation ward at St. Crispin's Medical Center in Memphis read the same chart on a Tuesday morning in February, saw something no one had documented, and wrote 6 words in red pen in the margin. Those 6 words were the beginning of the only honest conversation Margit had been given since the accident. If this is already reaching you, leave in the comments and tell me the name of your town. Margit had been in 3 facilities before St. Crispin's. The first was the acute care unit where they'd taken her from the accident scene, efficient, competent, focused on the immediate problem of keeping her alive, which they had done well. She had no complaints about the first facility except the one she carried in her own chest, the particular weight of lying in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning knowing that the reason she was there was a decision she had made. She had been running late for a board meeting. She always ran late for board meetings, not because she was disorganized. Margit Solis was the most organized person she knew, but because she scheduled herself without margins, the way people scheduled themselves when they believed time was the enemy and every gap was waste. She had been on her motorcycle, which she'd ridden to work twice a week since she was 26 and which gave her 20 minutes over the car through Memphis traffic. She had been through the yellow light at Commerce Street because it was yellow, not red, and she was late, and the delivery truck had come through the cross street with the right-of-way and the momentum of 14,000 pounds of freight. The official report said the truck driver had failed to yield. She had read the report from her hospital bed, and she had not corrected it. She had told herself in the weeks after that this was because the driver had technically been in the wrong. The light timing was off. His speed had been excessive. There was fault on his side, too. She had told herself that. She had believed it until about month 4, when she had been lying in the Nashville facility in the middle of a sleepless night, and had run the sequence in her head for what she estimated was the 200th time, and had understood with the clarity that came from 200 repetitions that she had made the choice. Yellow and late was still yellow and late. The truck driver had done what the truck driver had done, but she had been the one who'd chosen. She had not told anyone. Not Vera, not Marcus, not the specialists who had asked about the accident in the clinical way they asked about accidents, not for moral accounting but for biomechanical reconstruction. She had given them the biomechanics. She had kept the rest. This was, she understood, its own kind of weight. She had 14 months of managing clinical language and legal language, and the professional language of a CEO in absentia, and underneath all of it, she was carrying the specific, private knowledge that she had been in a hurry to a meeting, and had decided that the meeting mattered more than the light. The meeting had been a performance review. She had been the one being reviewed, or rather, the company had been being reviewed, by a prospective limited partner who was deciding whether to commit $150 million to Aldrich Capital's third fund. She had closed the review. She had gotten the commitment. She had been in surgery when the wire came through. She had thought about this sequence more times than she could count. The second facility was a specialized spinal rehabilitation center in Nashville, where she had spent 3 months working with a team that was excellent and methodical, and that had assessed her injury, C6 incomplete, meaning partial sensation and some voluntary movement in the upper extremities, nothing functional below, and had built her a rehabilitation plan that was evidence-based and thorough, and that she had followed with the same precision she brought to every other protocol she'd ever executed. She had done the work. She had followed the timeline. She had not cheated the sessions or the exercises or the measurements. The team had also, at the end of 3 months, confirmed what the original assessment had said. The injury was what it was, the prognosis was stable, and the work ahead was about adaptation and function within the existing parameters. She had not argued. She had learned, in 41 years of being a woman in rooms full of people who were more comfortable when she was agreeable, that argument was a choice. You chose your arguments carefully or you lost them all. What she had done was take the documentation home, all of it, and read it over 3 evenings. She had a particular habit with complex documentation. She read everything once quickly to understand the shape, then once slowly with a highlighter and margin notes, then once more with only the highlighted sections and her notes. By the end of the 3rd evening in Nashville, she had a 17-page summary of her own medical record and 3 questions that none of the team had answered. She had sent the questions to the team lead, who had been thorough and responsive and had provided good answers to 2 of the 3. The 3rd question, about the TMS threshold characterization methodology, had gotten a reply that was accurate and complete and that she understood to mean, "This is the standard characterization. This is what the standard characterization shows, and we are not going to revisit the standard," which was a defensible position, which was also not the same as an answer. The 3rd facility was a private rehabilitation institute outside St. Louis, which was where money bought access to things that weren't available elsewhere. The institute had 3 neurologists on staff and a technology research division and equipment that was not yet available outside clinical trial settings. She had been there for 5 months. The neurologists had been diligent. The technology had been impressive. The outcome had been the same. C6 incomplete, stable. The parameters were what they were. She had left St. Louis with 3 things: the TMS study documentation, which included a footnote about threshold variation that she had read 4 times and had still not gotten a satisfactory explanation of, the unanswered conviction that the standard characterization was not the territory, and the beginning of an idea about patient outcomes monitoring that had started as a frustration and was becoming, slowly, a framework. She had come to St. Crispin's because her attorney, a meticulous woman named Vera Park, who had been managing the legal and financial dimensions of Margot's life since the accident, had found a neurorehabilitation program there that was doing something with a particular combination of electrical stimulation and motor retraining that the other facilities hadn't been doing. Vera had sent Margot the research papers. Margot had read them in one evening and called Vera at 11:15 to say, "Schedule it." Aldrich Capital had, during the 14 months of her recovery, been managed primarily by Marcus Wren. Marcus was her co-founder, her equal partner, a man she had built a company with over 8 years on the basis of complementary capabilities. She was the vision and the client relationships. He was the operational infrastructure. They had worked well together. She had trusted him in the way you trusted someone you had built something with, which was not unconditional trust, but trust with a clear understanding of what the other person's interests were, and how those interests were usually aligned with yours. She had been watching, from 3 facilities in 3 cities, as Marcus's interests and her interests had begun to drift in the particular, subtle way that happened when someone believed the person they were working for was not coming back. He hadn't done anything wrong. She was clear about that. Every decision he'd made in 14 months had been defensible, and most of them had been correct. He had kept the firm running and the clients retained and the fund deployed according to plan. He had done the job. He had also, in the last 6 weeks, been doing something else. She could see it in the framing of the emails, in the options he presented that were not quite options, in the questions he asked that had the shape of questions but the function of positions already taken. She had been watching it the way she watched anything she was trying to understand, without acting on it until the picture was clear. She arrived at St. Crispin's on a Monday in early February. She arrived with 4 bankers' boxes of her own medical records, a laptop, a tablet, 2 phones, and the specific self-contained quality of a woman who had learned not to need the facility to accommodate her because the facilities did not accommodate her, not really, not in the ways that mattered. She had learned to bring her own. She had learned to map the ward before she needed it. She had learned to ask questions before she needed the answers, because the time you needed the answers was never the time you had to ask. She arrived in her power chair, which was custom-built and expensive, and which she drove with her left hand because the accident had left her right hand with limited fine motor function. She drove it the way she drove everything, precisely, without apology. The admitting nurse was a young woman named Deanna who was professional and kind and who looked at Margot's chair with the careful neutrality of someone trained to maintain eye contact. Margot appreciated the training. She appreciated it more when it was genuine, and with Deanna it was. She was shown to her room. The room was adequate. The window faced south, which meant afternoon light, which she preferred. The bathroom had the correct clearances. She was given the standard orientation to the ward and the standard introduction to the rehabilitation program and the standard assurance that she was in excellent hands. She thanked the orientation nurse. She unpacked her boxes. She connected her devices. She opened her laptop and worked for 3 hours because Aldrich Capital did not pause for the administrative details of a new facility. And Marcus Wren had sent her 4 emails that morning with the particular heading style he used when something required her decision, but he had already framed the options. She answered 2 of the emails. She deferred the other 2 until she had read the attachments more carefully, which she had learned was almost always the correct decision when Marcus had done the framing. The answer usually looked different when you'd read the full document. That evening, the charge nurse for the neurorehabilitation ward came in to do the overnight medication check. His name was Reed Calloway. He was 34, medium build, dark hair, going slightly gray at the edges in the way that happened to people who'd had a particular kind of hard decade. He moved through the room with the particular economy of motion of someone who had been doing this specific job for long enough that every action had been optimized without being mechanical. He checked the medication, noted something on the tablet, looked at her chart, the actual paper chart she'd brought, which she kept because she wanted her records accessible in a form that did not require a login, and said, "You brought your own chart. I've been to 3 facilities. I've learned to be prepared." He looked at the chart. Not glanced looked the way someone looked who was actually reading. He turned a page, turned another. He had the quality of attention that she recognized in herself, complete without performance. "How long have you been working in neuro?" she asked. 6 years on this ward, 4 before that in acute care." He turned another page. "Before that I was in oncology." She noted the slight change in register when he said oncology, the word that people said differently when it had personal weight. "What brings you to neuro from oncology?" she asked. He looked up from the chart. He studied her for a moment with the specific expression of someone deciding whether a question was a question or a probe. "The work," he said. "The recovery arc is different. In oncology you lose a lot. In neuro rehab people come back." He paused. "Sometimes more than anyone expected." She held his gaze. "That's an interesting thing to say to someone who's been told 14 months of things to expect." He looked at the chart again. He didn't say anything immediately. He was reading something. She could tell by the slight change in his attention, the way it sharpened on something specific. "Your January assessment is from the St. Louis Institute," he said. "Yes." "The TMS study." "Yes." He turned a page. "They documented residual motor signal in the C5 distribution." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he might note the weather. "Did they follow up on it?" She looked at him. "The documentation says trace signal, likely artifact." "I see that." He set the chart down. He took a pen from his breast pocket, a red pen, which she noticed, because people who worked in hospitals carried black pens and sometimes blue pens and almost never red pens. And he opened the chart to the January TMS page and wrote something in the margin. She couldn't see what he wrote from where she was. He closed the chart, left it on the bedside table, finished the medication check with the same unhurried efficiency he'd brought to everything else, and said, "The morning team will go through the full intake protocol. Your PT session is at 9. I'll note the TMS question in the handoff." "What did you write?" she asked. He looked at the chart. 6 words. He looked at her. "Ask the morning team to explain why this was filed as artifact rather than signal." She looked at him. "You can look at it," he said. "It's your chart." She reached for it. She turned to the January TMS page. In the margin in red pen in small, precise handwriting, "Why artifact and not signal? Quantify." 6 words. She set the chart down. "You've been on this ward for 6 years, she said. "Yes." "And you read the TMS documentation in," she checked the time, 4 minutes. 2 minutes, I read fast. He picked up the tablet. The morning team will have better context. I'm night charge. He moved toward the door. Sleep if you can. The PT intake is thorough. She watched him leave. She looked at the chart, at the 6 words in red pen. She had been in 3 facilities and had spoken to 15 specialists, and not one of them had asked that question in quite that way. Not as a challenge, not as uncertainty, as a specification. Quantify. She turned out the light at 11:30. She did not immediately sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about a red pen and 6 words and the specific quality of a mind that looked at a thing and asked for precision instead of accepting the shorthand. She had not met many people who did that. She thought about Marcus's emails, the 2 she hadn't answered yet. She thought about the framing of the options, the way each of them assumed a thing she hadn't agreed to assume. She went asleep at midnight. In the morning, she asked the PT intake team about the TMS documentation. They had no good answer. The morning team's intake took 2 hours, and it was thorough in the way that intakes were thorough when a facility was doing the thing right, not just reviewing the prior records but building a new baseline, starting fresh with the specific patient in front of them rather than the summary of the specific patient in the prior documentation. She appreciated this. She had spent 14 months being treated as her chart, which was not the same as being treated as herself. The physical therapist assigned to her case was a serious woman named Dr. B. Torrance, who had read the full chart, all 4 boxes of it, over the weekend before Margaret arrived. B had opinions. She expressed them cleanly and without qualification, which Margaret found immediately useful. But it was when they reached the TMS question that the morning shifted. B had looked at the January documentation. She had said, "I saw this too." Reed flagged it in the handoff. She had sat with it for a moment. The St. Louis team characterized it as artifact because the signal was below their threshold for clinical significance, which is a defensible call, but their threshold is their threshold. She had looked up. "Ours may be different," Margaret said. "What would quantifying it tell you? Whether the signal is consistent, whether it's localized or diffuse, whether there's a pattern." B had paused. "Whether the question worth asking is not is their signal, but what does this signal do under different conditions?" Margaret said. "Schedule the quantification." B had scheduled it for Thursday. That evening, Reed Calloway did the medication check again. She had been expecting it. Night charge was a rotating position, she'd understood. But he was also the one who'd written the 6 words, and she found herself, against her usual policy of not wanting anything from medical staff, wanting to know what he'd thought when B had confirmed the question. He came in at 9:15. He did the medication check. He looked at the chart where B had added her own note below his in blue pen. He read it. He said, "She's running the quantification on Thursday." "Yes, good," he made a notation. He did not elaborate on what he'd expected or what he thought the quantification might show, which she noted as the correct behavior. He was not building a narrative for her. He was doing his job and leaving the interpretation to the people whose job the interpretation was. "You have a daughter," she said. He looked up from the tablet. "Penny, she's 6. She lives with you." "Yes, my mother-in-law has her during shifts. It works." "Your wife?" A pause. The same slight register change as when he'd said oncology. "She died 3 years ago, ovarian cancer." He said it flatly, the way people said things they had said many times and had decided were facts rather than performances. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "Thank you. You were in oncology when she was diagnosed." He looked at her steadily. "I was her nurse before we got married, when she was first symptomatic." A pause. "I thought I knew what I was looking at. I deferred to the doctors." He said it without self-pity, just a thing that had happened, a thing he had done, a thing he carried. She was misdiagnosed for 14 months before someone found it. Margaret looked at him. 14 months, she said. "Yes. My accident was 14 months ago." He looked at the chart in his hands. "I noticed that," he said, which was not a coincidence observation but something more specific, the recognition of a number that had personal weight. She held his gaze for a moment. "The TMS question," she said. "Why did you ask it? You'd been on shift for," she calculated from the admitting time, 9 hours when you came in. "That chart is 4 boxes of material." He thought about it the way he thought about everything, which was actually. "Because I read what was there and I read what wasn't there, and the thing that wasn't there was a reason." He set the tablet down on the bedside table. Artifact is an answer. Artifact doesn't explain what generated the signal. I've learned to want the explanation, not just the answer. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because I missed the explanation on something important, he said. And it cost, he stopped. I've learned to be thorough. She looked at the chart on her bedside table at the red pen words in the margin. Go home, she said. You've been here long enough. He almost smiled. Not quite a brief relaxation around his eyes that was its own kind of thing. Shift ends at 11. Then go do the rest of your shift. He picked up the tablet. The Thursday quantification B will brief you, but if you have questions that come up at night, the overnight team can page me. I won't need you paged, she said. I know, he said, but the offer stands. He left. She worked until 1 in the morning. She answered Marcus's deferred emails finally with brief precision. She read 3 of the papers from her St. Louis records that she'd never read as carefully as she should have, and found, in one of them, a footnote that referenced exactly the kind of signal threshold variation that B had mentioned. Someone had known this was a question. They had filed it in a footnote. She thought about Reed Calloway in oncology, deferring to the doctors. She turned out the light. The first weeks at St. Crispin's had a different quality than the previous facilities. This was partly B, who ran the PT sessions with the kind of specificity that Margaret understood and respected. Not asking Margaret to do things without explaining why, not pretending the work was less hard than it was, not using the language of encouragement that she'd learned to find condescending. B said, "This is what we're doing, and this is why, and this is what success looks like for this particular exercise, and this is what I'll be measuring." Margaret found this restful in the specific way that clear information was restful when you had spent 14 months receiving managed information. This was also partly the ward itself, which was a working ward, people in various stages of neurorehabilitation, some arriving, some leaving, the full spectrum of what this kind of damage did to a human being and what the human being could do in return. She was not special here. She was a patient. She found, to her surprise, that she preferred it. And it was partly Reed. Not because he was present constantly. He wasn't. He worked his shifts, and his shifts were nights, and she had her days structured around PT and the Aldrich Capital work that did not pause because she was in a rehabilitation facility. But he had the quality of someone who noticed things and wrote them down and passed them to the right people without requiring acknowledgement, which meant that when she had a morning session that produced something worth noting, it had often already been noted by the time B arrived. She began, in the second week, to watch the chart the way she watched financial filings, for what was added when it was added and by whom. Reed's annotations were always in red pen. They were always brief. They always asked a question rather than making a claim. The morning of the Thursday quantification, she found a new one when she opened the chart before B arrived. The annotation was on the original C6 injury documentation, on the page that described the initial post-accident assessment. The note said, cross-reference T1 sensory mapping, was it done at acute? Date. She didn't know the answer. She looked for the answer in the boxes and didn't find it. When B arrived, she asked. B looked at the annotation. She said, "This is a fair question." She pulled up the acute care records on her tablet. She searched. The T1 mapping isn't documented in the acute care file. She looked at Margaret. That could mean it was done and not filed here, or it was not done. What would it change? Margaret asked. Potentially nothing. Potentially something about how the injury boundary was characterized. B set the tablet down. Let me request the complete acute care file from the original hospital. It may take a few days. Margaret nodded. The Thursday quantification took 3 hours and produced 40 pages of data. She did not read them all immediately. She read the executive summary, which B had prepared, and then she read the 3 most technical sections, which took her the rest of the afternoon. What the quantification showed was, the TMS signal from January was not artifact. It was trace, inconsistent, and below the St. Louis threshold for clinical significance, but it was present, it was localized, and it showed a pattern under specific stimulation conditions that artifact did not show. What does this mean? She asked B. B was careful, which Margaret appreciated. It means the question is still open, she said. It does not mean there is a clear path to function. It means there is something worth looking at more carefully before we close the chapter. What does looking more carefully look like? A new imaging protocol, a consultation with our attending neurologist, possibly a change in the stimulation component of your rehabilitation plan. Be paused. I want to be honest with you, this could lead nowhere. We may look more carefully and find the same picture in higher resolution, but we may not. Margaret sat with that for a moment. Schedule the neurologist, she said. That evening she told Reed about the quantification results when he came in for the medication check. She didn't know exactly why she told him. He wasn't her treatment team. He wasn't making clinical decisions about her case. He was the night charge nurse, and he had written 6 words in a red pen, and she found that she wanted him to know that the 6 words had mattered. B is pursuing it, she said. He looked at the chart at B's new annotations. He read them. He said, "Good." Said it simply, without the dramatic relief that she would have found irritating. Just the right question got the right response. "Good. You wrote a note this morning," she said, "about the T1 mapping." He looked up. "I saw it before B arrived," she said. "I don't know the answer." "B's requesting the acute care file," he said. "She mentioned it in the morning handoff." "How long have you been doing that?" "What?" "Reading charts at night and adding the questions that didn't get asked." He considered the question. "Since Fiona," he said. "Since I stopped deferring." She looked at him. "Did it ever cost you something with the doctors stepping outside your lane?" "Yes." He said it without defensiveness. "It cost me some relationships, a few people who thought I was second-guessing." He paused. "I decided I was okay with that." She thought about the people who had told her in the 14 months since the accident that she was too involved in her own case, that she needed to trust the process. That her asking questions was making recovery harder, not easier. She had not stopped asking questions. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "The ones who said you were second-guessing." "I told them I was asking questions," he said. "There's a difference." He made the medication notation. "The person the chart belongs to deserves the questions to be asked." She looked at the chart on her bedside table. "The person the chart belongs to," she repeated. "Yes." She looked at him, the night charge nurse with the red pen and the 6 words and the oncology background and the dead wife whose cancer had been missed for 14 months and the 6-year-old daughter named Penny who was at her grandmother's during shifts. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for the question." He nodded once, picked up the tablet and moved to the door. "Read," she said. He stopped. "If I ask you something tomorrow night, will you answer it honestly?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She nodded. He left. She opened her laptop and worked until 2 in the morning. She was building something. She had been building it since the St. Louis Institute, since the 5th facility consultation, since the afternoon in Nashville when the team had said stable and she had looked at the word stable and understood it was not the same as finished. She was building the framework for a patient outcomes monitoring system, the idea she kept coming back to at 2 in the morning in every facility she'd been in. The problem wasn't that the specialists were wrong. The problem was that the specialists were looking at a static picture of a dynamic thing. The signal was there. The signal had been there. Nobody was watching it in the right way to see it move. She wrote until she was tired. In the morning, she sent Marcus 2 emails. One about the Aldrich Q4 projections. One asking him to send her the complete partnership agreement, the original one, not the amendments, with the specific clause language about decision-making thresholds. He replied to the Q4 email within the hour. He did not reply to the partnership agreement email. The second month at St. Crispin's was the month she began to understand that Reed Calloway was one of the best nurses she had ever encountered, and that this was not, as it sometimes was with exceptional people, a thing he advertised. He had been doing the work for 10 years. He had built a specific expertise in neurorehabilitation that was not the expertise of the doctors. It was something adjacent and complementary and in some ways more granular, because he was there for the hours the doctors were not, reading the chart not to write orders but to understand the whole picture. He knew the patients on the ward the way people knew the terrain they walked every day. Not as case files, as people. This was not standard. Margaret had been in 3 facilities and had been the recipient of a great deal of competent medical care, and she had learned to distinguish between people who were doing their job well and people who were doing something more. The distinction was in the margins. The good ones did what was required. The rare ones did what was possible, which was sometimes different from what was required. Reed did what was possible. He was also, she noticed, consistently good with the patients who were difficult. Not in the patronizing way of medical professionals who prided themselves on managing difficult patients, but in the way of someone who understood that difficult patients were usually people who had been given insufficient information for too long and had learned that being difficult was the only way to get real answers. He met them where they were. He answered the real question behind the asked question. He didn't perform patience. He simply had it. He was good with her, in other words. In the third week, she began to notice the rhythm of his annotations. He worked 3 nights a week in 2-day shifts, staggered in a pattern that covered most of the ward's week. On the nights he worked, she would find new red pen notes in the chart by morning, sometimes questions, sometimes cross-references, sometimes a single word that was more direction than observation. She read them before B arrived. She had learned to think of them as her early morning briefing, the things that deserved attention before the day began. She asked him on the 4th week whether he did this for all the patients on the ward or only for the cases he found particularly interesting. He said, "All of them." She looked at him. "Every patient on this ward has a chart that deserves to be read at night," he said. "The day team is thorough, but things show up in the data at hours when no one is specifically looking for them. If no one looks, they stay where they are. You look," she said. "That's the job. It's more than the job." He thought about that for a moment. "I've learned that the job is more than the job," he said. "Or rather, I've learned what happens when it isn't." She watched him make the medication notation. She thought about Fiona, about the 14 months of misdiagnosis, about what he had said on the first night. "I deferred to the doctors." She thought about what that cost him to say and what it had cost him before he could say it. "Do you ever get it wrong?" she asked. One of the red pen questions. "Yes," he said it without hesitation. "I ask questions that turn out to be noise. I flag things that are artifacts after all. The TMS question might still have been nothing." He looked at her. "But I'd rather be wrong about a noise than silent about a signal." She looked at the chart on her bedside table. At the accumulation of red pen annotations, there were 11 now. She had counted them that morning. "Fiona," she said, "did she know you were looking?" He was quiet for a moment. "She knew I was worried. I told her I was worried." He set the tablet down. "What I didn't do was take the worry to the right place. I told her, and I didn't escalate it to her doctors the way I would have if she'd been my patient. I separated the roles." He said it flatly. "That was the mistake." She looked at him. "You thought separating the roles was protecting her." "I thought it was being a good husband." He picked up the tablet. "I thought being her husband meant trusting her doctors. It meant trusting her to decide what she wanted to pursue." He paused. "She didn't know she should be worried. I knew. I didn't tell her the way I would have told a patient." Margaret thought about the admission workup note, query for functional assessment when stable. The note that was 14 months old. The assessment that nobody had done. "Someone knew," she said. He looked at her. "About my case," she said. "The acute care team noted the query. They didn't follow up. Someone knew the question and put it in a note and no one escalated it." "Yes," he said. "Was it incompetence?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably not," he said. "Probably it was a decision made at 3 in the morning in the first hours after a significant trauma by a team managing immediate priorities." The query got noted and the note got filed, and the filing was the act of doing the right thing within the scope of what they had capacity for. He paused. The problem was on the other end. The people who received the file should have read it. They didn't. "They read the summary," he said. "The summary didn't include the subdocument." She thought about the 4 banker's boxes she had carried through 3 facilities. About the habit she had developed of bringing her own documentation because the documentation that traveled with her was never the whole documentation. "I've been trying to solve this problem for 6 months," she said. "The framework." He looked at the laptop on her bedside table. "The patient monitoring section," he said. "The part about continuous observation." "Yes." She looked at him. "The problem is that the information is discontinuous. The chart gets updated at intervals." The observations get made by different people with different scopes and different thresholds. And the thing that's real, the thing that's happening in the patient's body, is continuous. It doesn't wait for the note to be written. He was quiet for a moment. That's the problem. That's the problem, she agreed. And nobody is building the thing that solves it because the people who know the clinical side can't build the technology, and the people who can build the technology don't know the clinical side. He looked at her steadily. I know the clinical side, he said. I know you do. Neither of them said anything else that night. But she worked on the framework for 3 hours after he left, and the section she worked on was the one she'd been stuck on for 2 months. The one about the gap between the data that existed and the data that was being watched. She had been approaching it from the technology side, and she had been getting it wrong in a specific way that she could now see clearly, because Reed had named the shape of it without knowing he was naming it. The problem was on the receiving end. The summary was not the document. She wrote until 2 in the morning, and when she stopped, she had 30 pages that were better than anything she'd written before. She left them for him on the chart table with a note that said, "When you have time." In the morning, the note was gone. The red pen was back in the margin the following night. The third week brought the acute care file from the original hospital, and what be found in it changed the texture of everything. The T1 sensory mapping that Reed had asked about in his first marginal note. It had been done. It had been filed in a subdocument that hadn't been included in the transfer summary. The results were not what any of the subsequent facilities had been working from. There was preserved sensation in a distribution that the C6 characterization hadn't fully captured. B had been careful in the way she was always careful. She had not overpromised, had not used the language of breakthrough, had said, "This changes what we're looking for, not what you can do today." But the thing it changed was the thing that mattered, the map. She had been through 3 facilities and 15 specialists, and they had all been working from the same map. The map was based on a summary. The summary was not the document. The document, when someone read it in full, showed different territory. 6 words in red pen in the margin of a chart. That was all it had taken. 6 words that asked for a reason instead of accepting an answer, and then the work of following where the reason led. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about Reed at 28, standing in a hospital as someone's husband rather than someone's nurse, deciding that the roles were separate, deciding that trusting Fiona's doctors was the same as trusting the care she was getting. She thought about the 14 months she had spent in facilities that were competent and thorough and working from the wrong map. She thought about what it cost to ask the question that was obvious in retrospect and invisible in the present, the question that lived in the gap between what was documented and what was true. She thought about how you trained yourself to see that gap when everyone else was looking at the documentation. She opened her laptop. She added a section to the framework, not the patient monitoring section, a new section, one she hadn't known she was missing, the trained eye. On the development of clinical intuition as a systematic rather than innate capacity and its relationship to threshold calibration. She wrote it from Reed's example without naming him. She thought he would recognize it when he read it. She was right. He came in the following night and said, "The new section," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're arguing that the threshold is learnable." "I'm arguing that it's teachable," she said, "which is different and more useful." He read the section in the doorway, standing, which told her he had found it immediately and was not willing to wait until he was sitting down. She watched him read. She watched his expression and saw the moment he recognized himself in it, not surprise, more like, "This is accurate and I didn't know anyone was watching closely enough to see it." "This is the clinical validation argument," he said. "Yes. This is what the framework has been missing." "Yes," she said. "I needed to understand why the question got asked before I could build the system that ensures it gets asked." He set the chart down. He looked at her. "You've been building toward this since January," he said. "I've been building toward this since Nashville," she said. "I just didn't know what I was building toward until you showed me." He was quiet for a long time. "I'll keep reading," he said. She said, "I know you will." He finished the medication check and left. She worked until 1 in the morning, and the framework grew by 40 pages, and she was more certain than she had been in 14 months that what she was building was real and needed and possible. She thought, approximately 3 months behind where she should be on the build. She would make up the time. She always made up the time, he said. I read what's in the chart. That's not all of it, she said. I know. If there are materials you want me to see, I can read them. She gave him the 2 research papers from the St. Louis file that she had been returning to, the ones with the footnotes about threshold variation, the ones that had told her there was a question being asked at the margins of the field. She gave them to him at 9:15, and he came back at 11:20 with annotations in red pen. She read the annotations. They were precise and specific, and asked 2 questions that she had not yet asked B. She asked B the next morning. B said, "Those are good questions. How did you?" She looked at the papers. She saw the red pen. She looked at Margaret. "I'll look into both of them," Margaret said. "He's thorough." B said, "Yes." Something in her expression, not surprise, more like, "I know, and I'm glad you see it." The acute care file arrived from the original hospital in the 2nd week of February. B sat with Margaret to review the relevant sections. The T1 sensory mapping that Reed had asked about, it had been done. It had been filed in a subdocument that hadn't been included in the transfer summary. The results were not what any of the subsequent facilities had been working from. B looked at the mapping for a long time. She said, "The injury boundary may have been characterized differently if this had been included in the transfer." Margaret said, "Different how?" B said, "There is preserved sensation in a distribution that is inconsistent with a strict C6 characterization. The original acute care team may have been treating a C6 injury when the actual picture was more complex." She paused. "This doesn't change what you can do today, but it changes what we're looking for." Margaret said, "What are you looking for?" B said, "I'd like to run a complete sensory remapping, baseline everything from scratch with what we now know." She said, "Schedule it." That evening she told Reed. She told him the T1 mapping had been in a subdocument. She told him what B had said about the injury boundary. She told him because he had asked the question that had found the answer, and she believed that people who asked the right questions deserved to know what the answers were. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. "Is B running the remapping?" he asked. "Scheduled for next week." He nodded. He looked at the chart. He looked at her. "How are you doing with it?" he asked. "Not the clinical part." She looked at him. This was new. He had not asked that before. He had been scrupulously clinical in the first weeks, which she had appreciated, but which she now understood was not the full shape of how he worked. He had been learning her first. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been managing expectations for 14 months, both my own and everyone else's. I'm not sure I remember how to have an unmanaged one." He looked at her for a moment, not with the expression of someone preparing a response. With the expression of someone who had heard something real and was sitting with it. "Fiona used to say that," he said quietly, "that when she was sick, she managed everyone else's fear so constantly she forgot to let herself have any of her own." He paused. "It's expensive." Margaret looked at her hands in her lap, the right hand with its limited function, the left hand that had learned to do most of what she needed. "Yes," she said, "it is." "You're allowed to want this to be something," he said. "You don't have to wait until it's certain." She looked at him. He was not telling her to hope. That would have been the wrong thing. He was telling her that wanting was permitted, that there was a difference between unearned optimism and simple human wanting, that she didn't have to bracket the wanting in order to be responsible about the uncertainty. She had not been told that before. "Penny's at your mother-in-law's tonight?" she asked. "She is." He almost smiled. "She's going through a phase where she's decided she's an inventor. She builds things out of whatever she can find." "What's she building?" "Last week it was a vehicle for her stuffed animals. She used a cardboard box and some rubber bands and several things from my kitchen drawer that I've since had to replace." He paused. "The week before it was a communication device. I don't know exactly how it was supposed to work, but she'd written operating instructions for it in crayon." Margaret felt something ease in her chest which she had not expected. How detailed were the instructions? 3 pages, single-sided. He shook his head slightly. "She drew diagrams." "She's 6, Margaret said. "She is." He said it with the same specific warmth she'd heard in his voice when he talked about Fiona, the warmth that lived inside the grief rather than beside it. "She takes after her mother." Margaret looked at the window. Memphis outside, February dark, the hospital courtyard below with its bare trees and the lights of the parking structure beyond. She sounds like someone worth coming home to, Margaret said. She is, Reed said, simply and completely. She is. He finished the medication check. He left. Margaret opened her laptop. She worked on the patient outcomes framework for 2 hours, which had become her after 10 practice. The rehab day ended. The Aldrich Capital work was as settled as she could settle it, and the framework lived in the hours in between, growing in the specific way that ideas grew when they had the right soil. The right soil, she was beginning to understand, was this ward. She worked until midnight. She was happier than she'd been in 14 months. She filed this fact without examining it too closely, the way you filed a data point that hadn't been fully corroborated yet. It was real. She knew it was real. She just wasn't ready to name it. The complication from Marcus arrived in March. She had been expecting it. Not in its specific form, she had not expected the form, but in the general shape of it, because she had been watching the emails and the delayed replies and the framing of options for 6 weeks. And the pattern was readable once you knew what you were reading. He had sent the partnership agreement finally, 3 weeks after she'd asked. He had sent it with a cover note that said, "Per your request, though I'm not sure which clause you were concerned about. Let me know if you want to get on a call." She had read the partnership agreement over 2 evenings. She had found the clause. It was section 14.3, the incapacity provision, which had been drafted at the firm's inception as a general protection, and which said, in careful legal language, that in the event of a managing partner's medical incapacitation that prevented active participation in firm governance for a period exceeding 12 consecutive months, the remaining partners could establish an interim governance structure pending recovery or resolution. He had been medically incapacitated by any reasonable definition for 14 months. The clause was technically active. She had called Vera Park that evening. Vera had read the clause. Vera had said, "He hasn't invoked it yet." "No," Margaret said, "he hasn't, but he's considering it." "He's been building the case for 6 weeks," Margaret said. "The emails, the framing, he's not trying to push me out. He genuinely believes he's protecting the firm. He genuinely believes that's what this is." Vera was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter what he believes? It matters in terms of how I respond." She had looked at the partnership agreement on her screen. "If I respond defensively, I confirm the incapacity narrative. If I respond offensively, I create a conflict that destabilizes the firm. If I do nothing, the option remains available to him." "What do you want to do?" Margaret had thought about it. She had thought about the pattern of the emails, the specific items Marcus had been framing options on, the Q1 client retention decisions, the fund deployment timing, 2 partnership-level hiring decisions. He had been making these decisions, or pre-deciding them, in the way people pre-decided things when they believed the principal decision-maker was not coming back. He was not wrong that she had been managing from a distance. He was wrong about what that meant. "I want to demonstrate that I am not in fact incapacitated," she said. "How?" She had thought about that for 3 more days before she knew the answer. She told Reed about it on a Thursday night. She had not planned to. He had come in for the medication check, and she had been on the phone with Vera when he arrived. And when she ended the call, she had been in the specific state of someone who has been thinking hard about something alone for too long and needs to say it out loud to someone who will hear it rather than manage it. She told him the whole shape of it, the clause, the framing, the 6 weeks of emails. She told him what Marcus's concern probably was and what it probably wasn't. She told him what the options looked like from where she was sitting. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he said, "What do you want to happen? Not, what are you going to do? What do you want?" She looked at him. "I want to keep the company I built," she said. "And I want to build the thing I've been working on in the margins for 14 months, and I want to not have to choose between them." "Do you have to choose?" "Not if I'm fast enough." She looked at her laptop. The patient outcomes framework was 300 pages now, annotated and structured and almost ready for a different kind of conversation than she'd been having with herself. "I've been building something. It's real. It's ready to become real in a different way." She paused. "I need a co-builder, someone who knows the clinical side from the ground up." Reed looked at her for a moment. "I'm a nurse," he said. "I know what you are." She held his gaze. "I've been watching you read charts for 6 weeks. You see what's missing. That's exactly what the framework needs. She paused. I'm not asking you tonight, I'm telling you what I've been thinking. He was quiet. Read the framework, she said. She opened a file on her laptop and turned the screen toward him. Tell me what I'm missing. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that she understood he was actually reading, not surveying. He turned 2 pages. He read the executive summary. He looked up. This is based on your own case, he said. And every other case on this ward, she said. Every patient file I've been able to access. The problem isn't that the data doesn't exist. The problem is that nobody is watching it continuously and nobody is connecting the patterns. She paused. The signal is always there. Someone just has to be looking at it. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not surprise, because she'd learned that he was not easily surprised, but something more like recognition. The look of someone seeing a thing they had been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. I'll read it, he said. She closed the laptop. When you're done, tell me what I'm missing. What if I think you're not missing anything? Then tell me that. She looked at him directly. I've had too many people tell me what I wanted to hear. I'd rather have an honest read. He nodded once. He picked up the tablet. He moved toward the door. Read, she said. He stopped. Penny's at school tomorrow, until 3. He looked at her. Why? I want to know what her communication device was supposed to do, she said. The one with the operating instructions. Something in his face shifted, the slight relaxation that wasn't quite a smile, the one she had started watching for. She said it was supposed to let you talk to someone who wasn't in the room. Margaret looked at him. Yeah, he said. I know. He left. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and added 3 pages to the framework because the conversation had shaken something loose, and the something that was loose wanted to become a specification. She worked until 2. She was not managing her expectations anymore. She was building. Penny came to the ward on a Saturday in April. This had not been Margaret's idea, though she had said yes without thinking when Reed had mentioned on a Friday night that his Saturday shift had extended and his mother-in-law was visiting her own grandchildren that weekend, and that Penny would bring her, Margaret had said. Reed had looked at her. I work on Saturdays anyway, she said. She can sit in the common room. It's not a problem. It wasn't a problem for the ward either. The common room had a visitor policy that permitted children on weekends, and Reed's supervisor, a quiet woman named Carol who had been watching Reed do the work for 6 years with the specific appreciation of someone who understood what they had said fine without elaborating. Penny arrived at 9 in the morning. She was small, with dark curls and her father's attentiveness, and she walked into the St. Crispin's neurorehabilitation ward with the specific curiosity of a child who found new environments interesting rather than threatening. She was carrying a backpack and a large sketchbook and a pencil case that was, by its weight, substantially overpacked. She shook Margaret's hand when they were introduced. Actually shook it, small hand, firm grip, direct eye contact. Margaret had met Fortune 500 executives with less confident handshakes. Dad says you're very smart, Penny said. Dad is kind, Margaret said. He says it like it's a fact, though, not like it's being nice. Reed from the doorway, Penny. It's true. Penny looked at Margaret's chair with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she hadn't noticed it. Does it go fast? When I want it to. I'm going to build a motorized vehicle when I'm older, Penny said. For people who need them, but better than the ones that exist. She said it with the completeness of someone who had already decided. I've been doing research. How long have you been doing research? Penny thought about it. Since I was 4, but serious research since I was 5.5. She set her backpack down and opened it with the focused efficiency of someone who had packed it with a plan. I have notes. She produced a small composition notebook with her name on the cover in silver marker and index card tabs on the pages. Margaret looked at it. Can I see? Penny considered this. She handed it over. Margaret opened it. The notes were in pencil, careful and uneven, the handwriting of a 6-year-old who took handwriting seriously. There were sketches. There were measurements. There was a page titled Problems with Current Designs that had 7 items on it, all numbered, all specific. Item 4 was, weight distribution makes uphill harder than it needs to be. Item 6 was, controls not designed for people with different hand functions. Margaret looked at item 6 for a long time. She handed the notebook back. Item 6, she said. Penny looked at it. I know someone whose hands work differently, she said. I've been watching how she adapts. She did not say who, but she looked briefly toward the doorway where Reed was working. It made me think the controls shouldn't assume. They should adapt. Margaret looked at her right hand. The hand with the limited fine motor function. The hand she had spent 14 months learning to work around. That's correct, she said. Penny accepted this with the nod of someone whose research had been validated and moved on to the next order of business, which was finding a spot near the window with good light for drawing. Reed moved into the room to check the morning medication, and Penny set herself up in the chair by the window with her sketchbook and her overpacked pencil case, and began drawing with the quiet, focused intensity of a child who took drawing seriously. Margaret watched her for a moment. She thought about the research notebook, the numbered list of problems, the measured attention, the 7-year-old's version of the same thing she herself had been doing since the accident, looking at what was inadequate and specifying why. She opened her laptop. They worked in companionable silence for an hour, Margaret on the Aldrich Capital Q2 projections, Penny on something in the sketchbook that required considerable pencil selection and occasional critical assessment of angles. At 10:30, Penny looked up. What are you working on? Company finances, Margaret said. Penny considered this. The company you run? Yes. Is it going well? Margaret thought about Marcus's emails, the unanswered partnership agreement question, the clause she had been living with for 3 weeks. It's complicated, she said. Penny looked back at her drawing. Dad says complicated usually means something is changing and you don't know what it will be yet. Margaret looked at her. He says that about my drawings when I'm in the middle of them, Penny said. When it looks like a mess, but I know what it's going to be. Margaret looked at her laptop screen. At the Q2 projections and the Aldrich email thread, and the 3 weeks of building something that Marcus didn't know she was building. That's a useful way to think about it, she said. Penny nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the drawing. Margaret worked for another hour on the framework, the section about designing systems for the full range of users rather than the assumed standard user. She was writing faster than she usually wrote. Something about the child at the window with her numbered list of problems was clarifying something that had been blurry. At noon, Reed brought them both lunch from the ward cafeteria. He set a tray beside Margaret's workstation and another on the table by Penny's chair, and Penny immediately began telling him what she'd been working on, which turned out to be a detailed architectural drawing of the neurorehabilitation ward as seen from the window, proportionally accurate, in pencil, with the outdoor courtyard and the parking structure, and the February trees rendered with the attentiveness of someone who found the world worth documenting. Margaret looked at the drawing from across the room. "Can I see it?" she asked. Penny brought it over. She held it up. The drawing showed the courtyard from above. Somehow, the perspective was aerial with the rehabilitation paths and the bench placements in the trees, and in the corner, small but precise, a figure in a chair on the path. "Is that me?" Margaret asked. "I saw you from the window on Wednesday," Penny said. "During your outdoor PT session. You were going fast around the corner and I thought the perspective was interesting." She pointed. "I didn't get the chair quite right. I'll fix it." Margaret looked at the drawing. At the small figure in the corner, the particular angle of it, not static, not posed in motion. "Don't fix it," she said. Penny looked at her. "It's accurate," Margaret said. "That's what it looks like." Penny examined the drawing with the critical attention of someone who took accuracy seriously. She seemed to accept the assessment. She signed it in the bottom right corner, P. Calloway, in careful print and held it out to Margaret. "You can have it," she said. Margaret took it. She looked at it for a moment. At the small figure going fast around the corner, at the courtyard and the trees, at the child's precise notation of the world as she found it. She thought about the 14 months of being in facilities and being assessed and being characterized, the months of being someone's chart, someone's case file, someone's clinical notation. The months of being looked at by people who were looking for the data they needed rather than the person they had. This child had looked out a window on a Wednesday afternoon and drawn what she'd seen. A figure in a chair going fast. Not the chair, not the injury, the going fast. "Thank you," she said. Penny went back to her lunch. Reed caught Margaret's eye across the room. He had the expression she had learned to read in 6 weeks, the one underneath the professional steadiness, the one that surfaced when something had gotten past the perimeter he kept. He was not managing it. She looked back at the drawing. She set it on the windowsill against the glass facing the room. Later in the afternoon, when Reed was on break and Penny had fallen asleep in the chair with her sketchbook open in her lap, the ward was quiet in the particular way of a hospital weekend afternoon, slower, warmer, the pace dropping to something less institutional. Margaret worked on the framework. She was in the section on signal monitoring, and she found what she'd been missing, the patient perspective. Not as data, but as context. The patient as the primary observer of their own body, the one with the most continuous access to the information, the one whose observation was consistently undervalued by a system designed to treat observation as anecdote. She wrote, "The patient is not an unreliable narrator. The patient is the primary source. The clinical record is a transcript, not the document." She wrote for an hour without stopping. When Reed came back from break, Penny was still asleep. He looked at his daughter in the chair. He looked at Margaret. "She does that," he said quietly, "falls asleep when something's absorbing and then he made a small gesture. She goes hard until she stops." "She's good company," Margaret said. He looked at her carefully. "For you, I don't usually say things I don't mean." He was quiet for a moment. "She likes you. She tells me when she likes people and when she doesn't, and she doesn't always get it right, but he looked at Penny. "She's usually right about the people who are worth knowing." Margaret looked at the drawing on the windowsill, at herself going fast around the corner. "The research notebook," she said. "Item 6, controls not designed for people with different hand functions." He looked at her. "She said she'd been watching someone adapt," Margaret said. "I assume she meant me." "She has been," he said. "She was watching you in the PT courtyard one day and she came home and added the item to the notebook." He paused. "She doesn't share the notebook with many people. She showed it to me within the first 10 minutes. He looked at Penny sleeping in the chair. "That's her version of saying she trusts you," he said. "She doesn't show the notebook to people she doesn't trust. She showed it to 3 people before you, me, her grandmother, and her first-grade teacher." Margaret held that for a moment. "She doesn't look at me the way most people look at me," she said. "No," he said. "She doesn't." "Most people look for what's missing," she said. Penny drew what was there. He was quiet. He looked at the drawing on the windowsill. "Fiona was like that," he said. "She looked at what was there instead of what was absent. She said most people spent so much energy on what was wrong that they missed what was working." Margaret looked at him. He was still looking at the drawing. "She would have liked you," he said. Not performing it, just placing it like a fact that had been sitting with him for a while and was ready to be said. "Because I'm difficult," Margaret said. He looked at her. "Because you're specific," he said. She valued specificity. She was impatient with vagueness. She said vague people were usually people who hadn't done the work. He paused. "She would have found you interesting. She would have wanted to talk to you." Margaret looked at her right hand. "I think I would have found her interesting too," she said. He nodded once. A brief silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it, the silence of 2 people who were both sitting with something real and had decided to let it sit. "Reed," she said. "Yeah. I finished the framework section I was stuck on." She turned the laptop screen toward him. "I'd like you to read it tonight on shift if you can find time." He looked at the screen. He looked at her. "What's the section?" "Patient as primary monitor," she said. "I think it's the thing I was missing." Read the opening for a moment. His expression shifted the specific way his expression shifted when he was reading something that was accurate to his experience. "I'll read it tonight," he said. "Tell me what I'm wrong about," she said. He looked up. "What if you're not wrong about anything?" "Then tell me that," she said, "but you'll have to be specific." He almost smiled, that particular brief relaxation she'd been watching for 3 months. "I can be specific," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. Penny stirred, woke with the instantaneous clarity of a child whose sleep was not gradual, and looked around the room. She found her father. She looked at Margaret. She said, "Did I miss anything?" "Nothing important," Reed said. Penny looked at the drawing on the windowsill. She looked at Margaret. Something in her expression settled into the particular satisfaction of a child who has left something of herself in a room and found it still there. "Good," she said. She picked up her sketchbook and started drawing again. The moment Reed told Margaret what he'd found happened in April. on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not a time she expected important things to happen. Important things, in her experience, happened in boardrooms and on the phone at midnight and in the specific hours before and after bad news. They did not typically happen on a Tuesday afternoon when B was running the remapping protocol and the ward was full of its ordinary activity. But B had come to her room at 2:30 with a specific expression, the expression Margaret had learned to read over 3 months of sessions, the one that meant something had shifted in the data, and she had said, "I want to show you something." The remapping had taken 3 sessions over 2 weeks. What it showed, compared to the original injury characterization, was a more complex picture. Not a correction, B had been careful to say. The original characterization had been accurate for what it measured. But the mapping was more extensive, more textured. There were preserved areas and transitional areas and areas of partial function that the C6 classification had not fully captured because the classification was a category and the category was not the territory. "What does this change?" Margaret asked. B said, "It changes the target for the stimulation protocol. We've been working from the C6 assumption. If we recalibrate for this map," she showed her the revised parameters. "The protocol becomes more specific, more precise." "How specific?" "Specific enough that Reed has been thinking about it." Margaret looked at her. "What has Reed been thinking?" B said. "He read the patient monitoring section of your framework last week. He came to me yesterday morning." She paused. "He had something to show me." She pulled up the notes from a session from 2 weeks earlier, a PT session that Margaret had not thought was notable. During this session, there was a moment about 40 minutes in when you were working on the grip exercise for your right hand. The electrode readings from that session show a brief motor output in the right index finger that is distinct from the baseline. Margaret looked at the data. "It lasted approximately 2 seconds, B said. "I didn't note it at the time. I wasn't looking for it." Reed was. He reviewed the session logs as part of a documentation review he does every week. B looked at her. "He saw it in the data before I did." Margaret was quiet. "He cross-referenced it with the remapping and with the patient monitoring section of your framework," B continued. "His note to me yesterday said, 'The signal in session 12 matches the preserved area in the new map. This is not noise.'" In red pen, Margaret thought. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means," B said carefully, "that the right index finger produced a voluntary motor output under specific conditions, and that we have now created a map that tells us which conditions to target." She paused. "I want to modify the stimulation protocol. I want to see if we can reproduce it deliberately." Margaret looked at her right hand. The limited fine motor function she had been working around for 14 months, the hand she had learned to do without, the hand that the accident had taken with everything else it had taken. "When?" she said. "I want to start the modified protocol next week," B said, "but I wanted to show you this first." Margaret nodded. "There's one more thing," B said. She pulled up a second note. "This is from the acute care file, the T1 mapping that Reed asked about." She showed her the relevant page. The original acute team noted something in the admission workup that wasn't transferred. It says, "Patient reports sensation in bilateral upper extremities beyond documented injury level, query for functional assessment when stable." The note was dated the morning after the accident. They had never done the functional assessment. Margaret looked at the note. She looked at her right hand. She looked at the window, at the Memphis afternoon, at the ordinary April sky. She had been in 3 facilities. She had been assessed by 15 specialists. Not one of them had followed up on a note from the admission workup that said, "Query for functional assessment when stable." She had been stable for 13 months. "Schedule the modified protocol," she said. Her voice was level. It was not calm exactly, but it was level. "Margaret," B said, "I want to be honest with you. This may produce nothing. The signal may not be reproducible. The map may be more complex than the protocol can address. I know. I want you to have expectations that are B." Margaret looked at her. "I have spent 14 months managing my expectations. I am done managing them. Schedule the protocol and let the data tell us what it tells us." B looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. "Next Tuesday." When she left, Margaret sat with her laptop open and did not work. She looked at her right hand. She thought about the note from the admission workup, the one that was 14 months old, the one that said query for functional assessment when stable. She thought about every session, every facility, every specialist. She thought about the weight of being thorough about the wrong map. She thought about Reed's red pen. She called Vera. "I'm moving on Marcus," she said. "This week. I need to get ahead of the clause," Vera said. "What's changed?" "I'm building something that will demonstrate I'm not incapacitated. I want to present it to the Aldrich partners before Marcus invokes the clause." She paused. "Can you get me the list of the limited partners' direct contacts?" Vera said she could. Margit started writing. The partners' meeting happened on a Thursday in May, 3 weeks after the modified protocol began, and 4 days after something happened that she had not told anyone about yet, not even Reed. On a Sunday morning in the PT room, B had been running the targeted stimulation exercise for the 4th time. The electrode placement was precise now, mapped to the specific area the remapping had identified. Margit had her right hand on the table and B had said, "Try to flex just the index finger, isolate it from the others." She had tried it before. It hadn't worked. She tried it. The index finger moved, not dramatically, not cleanly. A small flex, maybe 30 degrees, visible to both of them, deliberate, voluntary, hers. B had written something on the clipboard. She had not said anything dramatic because B was not a person who said dramatic things. She had said, "Again." Margit had done it again. 3 times. 3 voluntary flexions of the right index finger on a Sunday morning in Memphis, 14 months after an accident that had taken it. B had set the clipboard down. She had looked at Margit with the expression of someone who had been doing this work for 15 years and had learned not to let the work move them too visibly because the patients needed them steady. She had maintained that expression with some effort. "That's a voluntary motor output," B had said. "Yes," Margit had said. "We'll build on it." Margit had looked at her right hand. She had looked at it for a long time. She had not cried. She was not, in general, a person who cried. But something had shifted inside her chest, something that had been in one position for 14 months and had moved, and the movement had its own weight. She had driven her chair back to her room. She had sat at her window. She had looked at the Memphis afternoon, the April quality of it, the particular light that came when winter had finally decided it was done, and she had thought about the note in the admission workup, the one nobody had followed up on, and about Reed's red pen in the margin, and about 6 words that had asked a question that had found an answer. The note had said, "Query for functional assessment when stable." She had been stable for 13 months before anyone asked it. She had been in 2 facilities after the acute care unit, with thorough and competent teams, and not one of them had followed up on that note. Not because they were careless, because the note was in a subdocument and the subdocument had not traveled with the summary, and the summary was what everyone had read. The summary was not the document. She had been building a system that solved exactly this problem for 6 months from inside the problem, without fully understanding that she was inside the problem. She had thought she was building from observation. She had been building from experience. Reed had shown her the difference. She sat at her window and looked at the Memphis afternoon and held 3 voluntary flexions of the right index finger in her chest like something she was not yet ready to share. She had not told anyone until the partners' meeting. The partners' meeting was held via video conference, as all Aldrich Capital meetings had been since the accident. There were 7 limited partners and Marcus. She had sent them the framework, not the full 300 pages, but the executive summary and the first 40 pages, which were the pages that made the case for why the system was needed and what it was built to do. She had sent it with a cover note that said, "This is what I have been building. I want to walk you through it." She had also, in the week before the meeting, done something she had not done in 14 months. She had called 4 of the 7 limited partners directly, not about the framework, not about the clause, but about Aldrich Capital's Q2 performance and the fund deployment strategy, and the 3 federal relationships she had been quietly building from her hospital room and her 3 facilities. She had talked to them the way she talked to people when she was at full capacity, not managing them, not performing executive function, but thinking out loud with them about what the firm was doing and where it was going. 3 of the 4 had called her back within 24 hours with follow-up questions. She had answered the questions. She had known, when she drafted the partners' meeting invitation, that the meeting was not about the framework. The framework was the proof. The meeting was about who she was and who she had remained, and whether the people in that room had been watching closely enough to know. Marcus had seen the summary. He had sent her a message the night before. "Are you sure this is the right time for a new initiative?" She had replied, "Yes." The meeting lasted 90 minutes. She presented for 45 of those minutes, and she presented the way she always presented, precisely, without hedging, with the data making the argument rather than the other way around. She presented the framework and the market analysis, and the patient outcomes data she had built from the St. Crispin's ward records. She presented the technical architecture of the monitoring system, and the 3 pilot client relationships she had already begun, quietly, through her own contacts in the healthcare infrastructure space. She presented Reed's contribution anonymized because she hadn't asked him yet as the clinical validation framework, the piece that made the system function rather than simply exist. And then she said the thing she hadn't planned to say until she was saying it. "I want to tell you where this came from," she said. The screen showed 7 faces and Marcus's. She looked at all of them. "I have spent 14 months in rehabilitation facilities," she said. 3 facilities, 15 neurological specialists, a diagnosis that was characterized from an incomplete record. The information that would have changed my treatment had been in my file since the day of the accident. It was filed in a subdocument. It was never included in the transfer summary. Nobody read it until a charge nurse on a night shift 4 months ago asked a question that nobody else had thought to ask. She paused. That question changed my treatment plan. It changed what we know about my injury. It changed what I am building toward. She paused again. The question was 6 words. It was written in red pen in the margin of my chart. The room was very quiet. Cairn Health Analytics exists because that question should be asked for every patient in every facility in every ward, she said. Not because someone happens to be thorough enough to ask it, because the system requires it. Because the gap between what is documented and what is true is where patients fall through, and I have been one of those patients, and I am done building a company in a world where that gap isn't being closed. She looked at Marcus. He was looking at the framework document. When she was done, a limited partner named David Park said, "This is ready to launch. The pilot phase is ready," she said. "Full launch in Q3 with adequate capitalization." He said, "What are you asking us for?" "A vote," she said. "I want the partnership to commit seed capital for the Cairn Health Analytics pilot. I want the governance decision to be on record before the end of this quarter." She looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the screen. He looked at the framework document he had opened on a second window. He looked at Margaret. He said, "The clause." "Yes," she said. He was quiet. "You could have invoked it," she said. "You had the grounds. 14 months, active governance participation limited." She held his gaze. "You chose not to, I know that. I also know you were making decisions that required my authorization and you were making them without it." She paused. "I'm not here to litigate that. I'm here to tell you that I am not incapacitated and I am ready to demonstrate it, and I'd like to do that by building something." Marcus looked at the framework document. He said, "The clinical validation framework, who built it?" "A colleague," she said. "A specialist in patient outcome monitoring with 10 years of clinical experience." Marcus read for a moment. He said, "This is good work." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man who had been running a company for 14 months and had told himself, probably honestly, that he was doing it for the firm, and who was looking now at the person who had built the firm and understanding that the story he'd been telling himself had been incomplete. "I'll move the seed capital vote," he said. The vote was 7-1. Marcus voted yes. After the meeting, Vera called. She said, "He backed down. He made a business decision," Margaret said. "I gave him a better option than the clause." "What are you going to do about the decisions he made without authorization?" Margaret thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "Not now. Most of them were the right calls, and the ones that weren't I can correct." She paused. "He was trying to protect the company." "He was wrong about what that meant," Vera said. "You're more generous than I would be." "I'm practical," Margaret said. "There's a difference." That evening she told Reed, She told him about the meeting, about Marcus, about the vote. She told him about the Sunday session which she had been holding for 4 days, which had become something she could only say out loud to someone who would know what it meant. She said 3 times on Sunday. He sat with that. 3 voluntary flexions, she said. He looked at her right hand. He looked at her. Be documented it. The session log is in the chart. She paused, with an annotation. He almost smiled. Red pen, blue pen, it was B. She looked at her hand. But you found the session 12 signal. You were looking when she wasn't. That's my job. That's more than your job, she said. You know that. He was quiet. I want to name you as clinical co-founder of Cairn, she said. Not because you work here and not because you've been helpful. Because you have built exactly the clinical validation framework the system needs in the margins of your night shifts, and because you see what's missing in the same way I do. She met his eyes. I want to build this with you. He looked at her for a long time. I'm still a nurse on this ward, he said. I know that. I'm not asking you to stop being that. Penny is part of any equation that involves you, she said. I understand that. I'm not asking for anything that changes what she needs from you. He looked at his hands. He looked at the chart on her bedside table, her chart, the one with the red pen annotations, the one she had been carrying through 3 facilities in 14 months. What would it look like? He said. The co-founder role. You build the clinical validation layer, she said. The framework that translates what happens in the clinical environment into the data the system needs. The part that requires someone who knows what the chart isn't saying as well as what it is. She paused. That's you. That's what you've been building in the margins for 6 years. He was quiet. The system doesn't work without that layer, she said. I built the architecture. I can build the technology side and the business side and the federal relationship. But the clinical validation is the thing that makes it real instead of theoretical. And the person who does that work needs to be someone who has actually been on a ward at 2 in the morning reading charts that everyone else read during the day. He looked at the chart. I've been building it, he said. The validation framework since you showed me the first draft. I know. I didn't know that's what I was building. I know that too, she looked at him steadily. I watched you figure it out. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet because she had learned in 3 months that his quiets were working quiets. He wasn't absent, he was calculating. He was doing what he did with charts, reading all the way through before he said anything. Penny, he said. She asked me last week whether Cairn was the thing you were building at night. Margaret looked at him. I said yes, Reed said. She said, is Dad going to help? I said I didn't know. She said, he stopped. He was almost smiling. She said, Dad, when someone is building something real and they ask you to help, you help. Margaret looked at the windowsill, at the drawing of herself going fast around the corner, signed in the bottom right corner. She's 6, Margaret said. She is, Reed said. She's also right. He picked up the tablet. He set it back down. Can I think about it? He said. Yes. How long do I have? Take what you need. She looked at him directly. I'll be here. He nodded once. He left. She looked at the window. At the Memphis evening outside, the city going about its business, the parking structure lights coming on as the sky darkened. She looked at the drawing on the windowsill and the chart on the bedside table and the laptop open to the framework section she'd been writing. She looked at her right hand. She flexed the index finger. Once, twice, 3 times. She opened her laptop and added a page to the framework, the page she had been holding back, the page about the things you found only when you were willing to look without the assumption that the answer was already known. She wrote it from memory, from 14 months, from 3 facilities and 15 specialists and 6 words in red pen. She wrote until midnight. Reed came back at 2 in the morning. Not for the medication check, that was done. He came to the doorway of her room and stood there. She looked up from the laptop. Yes, he said. She looked at him. I've been thinking about it since March, he said. Since the first time you showed me the framework. I kept waiting to see something in it that I thought was wrong and I kept not finding it. He paused. And I kept coming back to the same thing. Fiona was missed for 14 months because nobody was watching the signal continuously, because the information existed but nobody had built the system to hold it. He looked at her. That system is what you're building. She held his gaze. I'm going to help, he said. Not because someone asked me to, because the problem is real and the framework is right and I can do the work. She looked at the chart on her bedside table. Okay, she said. He nodded once. He left. She looked at the empty doorway. She looked at the chart. She looked at the laptop. She smiled, not managed, not performed, just the small, involuntary thing that happened when a door opened that had been closed. She went back to work. The partnership was announced in a June press release that described Cairn Health Analytics as a joint venture between Aldrich Capital and a clinical outcomes specialist with 10 years of neurorehabilitation experience. The press release did not name Reed, because Reed had asked to be kept out of the public materials until the pilot had data and the data could speak for itself. She had agreed. The pilot launched in July at 2 clinical sites. By September, it had produced enough data to present to the Federal Healthcare Infrastructure Committee that Vera had been cultivating as a potential government client. The presentation was scheduled in Washington in October. Reed traveled with her. It was the first time he had been on a plane since Fiona's funeral, which he told her in the car to the airport, matter-of-factly in the way he said most things. She looked at him. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I will be," he said. "It's a different trip." She held his gaze for a moment. She reached across and put her hand on his, her right hand, the one with the limited function, the one that had surprised her on a Sunday morning in April with 3 small movements that had changed the map. She laid it on the back of his hand. He turned his hand over and held hers. They didn't say anything else. The federal presentation lasted an hour and 15 minutes. The committee had read the framework. They had questions, good questions, the kind that meant they were building the case for yes rather than looking for reasons for no. Margaret answered them. Reed answered the clinical validation questions with the same directness he brought to everything, without hedging, without deferring. When it was done, the committee chair, a careful woman who had been in federal healthcare policy for 20 years, said, "This is the first proposal I've seen in this space that solves the actual problem." Reed was sitting beside Margaret. He looked at her. She looked at him. "That was the intention," she said. That evening they were in the hotel lobby waiting for the car back to the airport when Reed said, "Penny wants to know if you're coming to her school presentation next month." Margaret looked at him. "What kind of presentation?" "Science fair." He almost smiled. She built the communication device, the one with the 3 pages of operating instructions. She made it functional. Penny made a working communication device. She used a Raspberry Pi and some code she found online and apparently about 15 hours of work at the kitchen table. He paused. "She's 6. She's going to be terrifying," Margaret said, "when she's grown." "I know." He said it with the warmth that lived in the grief and underneath it and past it. "She takes after her mother." Margaret looked at him. At the man who had read a chart in the dark with a red pen and asked a question that had become the thread that had become this. A federal presentation and a pilot program and a company and a June evening in a Washington hotel lobby and a 6-year-old science fair project and the right index finger flexing 3 times on a Sunday morning. She said, "I'd like to come to the science fair." He looked at her. "If the invitation is genuine," she said. "It's genuine," he said. The car arrived. She drove her chair to it and he got the door and they loaded in, Memphis the destination and the city going dark around them. And she thought about the 14 months and the 15 specialists and the 6 words in red pen that had started this, and about what it meant to be seen accurately. She had spent 14 months being looked at by people who were looking at her chart. He had looked at her chart and seen her. That was the difference. That was the whole of it. She looked at his hands on his knees at the Memphis highway going past at the ordinary night. "Reed," she said. "Yeah. Thank you." He looked at her. He didn't ask what for. He knew what for. "Any time," he said. The car moved through the dark. She thought about the 14 months, the 3 facilities, the 15 specialists reading the same map and finding the same territory because the map was the map and nobody had asked whether the map was complete. She thought about Reed at 2 in the morning in the 9th hour of a shift, in the quiet of a ward that had settled into its nighttime register, with a red pen and a chart that nobody had asked him to read carefully. He could have done the medication check and made the notation and moved on. He had done the medication check and made the notation and then opened the chart and read it the way he read everything, all the way through. 6 words, not grand, not heroic. Just here is a gap and the gap deserves to be named. She thought about Penny's notebook, the numbered list of problems, item 6. The The child who had watched someone adapt and had written it down because the adaptation should not have been necessary, because the design should have accounted for it, because someone had not asked the right question when the thing was built. The apple doesn't fall far, she thought. Read, she said. Yeah. Penny is going to build the vehicle, she said. The one for people who need them. The one that accounts for different hand functions. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. She's going to need capital at some point, Margaret said. When she's ready. She heard something in the car that was not quite a laugh but was in the direction of a sound of being known in the specific way that happened when someone paid attention to the things you loved. I'll keep that in mind, he said. Memphis outside. The river somewhere to the left, dark and enormous. The ordinary city going about its ordinary night. She held his hand. She looked out the window at the dark. She was building something real. So was he. So apparently was Penny. The car moved through the dark toward home. Penny's science fair was in November. The communication device worked. The judges gave it the top prize and Penny accepted the certificate with the specific controlled dignity of a child who had expected this and was maintaining her composure about it. Afterward in the school gymnasium she sat at the table with Margaret and showed her the operating instructions, all 3 pages, now clean and printed rather than crayoned. You rewrote them, Margaret said. I updated them when the design changed, Penny said. The specifications changed 5 times during development. Margaret read the operating instructions. They were complete. They were accurate. They included a troubleshooting section. You included a troubleshooting section, Margaret said. It seemed important, Penny said. Things go wrong, you should know what to do. Margaret looked at the troubleshooting section. She looked at Penny. Your father would agree with that, she said. Penny nodded, satisfied. I know. She looked across the gymnasium to where Reed was talking to Penny's teacher. She looked back at Margaret. Are you going to keep coming to things? Margaret looked at her directly. Is that what you'd like? Penny thought about it with the seriousness she brought to everything. You're different than Dad's other work friends, she said. How so? They don't come to things, she said simply. You do. Margaret looked at the operating instructions in her hands, at the table with the Penny's name card and the blue first place ribbon, at the room full of parents and teachers and children with their projects, the ordinary machinery of a life being lived. Yes, she said. I'm going to keep coming to things. Penny nodded. The question was answered. She moved on to the next thing. That evening, driving back to Margaret's apartment, because she had an apartment in Memphis now, because St. Crispin's had become her city, because Aldrich Capital had a Memphis office, because there were reasons that had accumulated without being named, Reed said. She asked you directly. She did. She doesn't ask questions she doesn't already know the answer to. He was looking at the road. She gets that from her mother. Margaret looked out the window at Memphis going past, the river, the bridges, the particular evening light of November, gold and cold. She thought about the things she had built in the last year. The framework, now a company, now a federal pilot, now a thing that was real in the world. The right index finger that had remembered something on a Sunday morning. The 6 words in red pen that had become a year and more. Read, she said. Yeah, she said. I think you should know, she stopped. Started again. I don't know how to do this quietly. I've tried to do it quietly and it doesn't have a quiet version. He looked at her briefly, then back at the road. I've been in love with you since March, she said. Since the night I told you about the partnership clause and you asked me what I wanted instead of what I was going to do. She looked at her hands. I didn't know what to call it then. I know now. He drove. I'm telling you, she said, because I am done keeping things I know in categories I'm not prepared to act on. He pulled the car to the side of the road. He put it in park. He turned to look at her. The session 12 signal, he said. She looked at him. I saw it in the data and I sat with it for 3 days before I took it to be, he said, because I needed to be sure it was what I thought it was and not what I wanted it to be. He paused. That's how I work with things that matter. She held his gaze. I've been working on this since March too, he said. She said, and I'm sure, he said simply. It's what I thought it was. She looked at him across the car, at the man with the red pen and the 10 years of night shift and the daughter who built things and left operating instructions, at the man who had asked the question that had changed the map. She reached out and put her right hand over his, the right hand, the one with the voluntary flex and the history and the month of Sunday mornings. He held it. Memphis outside the windows, November quiet, the city going on without them. "Okay," she said, which was not a small word. He started the car. There is a version of this story that makes it about the right index finger. The 3 voluntary flexions on a Sunday morning, the modified protocol, the mapping that found what 15 specialists had not found. That version is clean and measurable and has the particular satisfaction of a problem that was solved. But the finger was not the point. The point was the question in the margin. The 6 words in red pen that asked why artifact and not signal, that asked for precision instead of accepting the shorthand, that asked the question the chart deserved rather than the question it was easier to ask. Margit Solis had been in 3 facilities and assessed by 15 specialists, and they had all been competent, and several had been excellent, and not one of them had stopped to ask that particular question. Not because they were wrong. Because they were looking at a category, and the category was not the territory, and no one had told them the territory was more complicated than the map. Reed Calloway had read the chart of a woman he'd never met in the 9th hour of a night shift and seen the thing that wasn't there, a reason, a gap between what was documented and what it meant. He had asked for the reason in 6 words, and those 6 words had become the thread, and the thread had become a modified protocol, and the modified protocol had become 3 flexions on a Sunday morning, and the 3 flexions had become Cairn Health Analytics, and Cairn Health Analytics had become a federal pilot program. And all of it had become a car parked on a Memphis street in November with a right hand held over a left hand and the particular silence of 2 people who had both been carrying something for a long time and had finally set it down. There is also something worth saying about what they each brought to the other that was not the obvious thing. The obvious thing was, she had money and connections, and he had clinical knowledge and the framework. That was the transaction. That was the version of the story where 2 complementary people find each other and build a company, and everything is neat. The real thing was stranger and harder. What Margit gave Reed was the thing he had stopped letting himself build toward. He had been in motion for 3 years, filling the space Fiona had left with work and shifts and Penny's schedule, with the logistics of a life managed rather than lived. He had been thorough and careful and present in every specific task, and absent from the larger project of wanting things for himself. She had handed him a framework document in the dark and said, "Read this and tell me what I'm wrong about." She had treated his knowledge as something worth having, not something worth noting. She had done it from the beginning, from the first question in the margin, when she had been a CEO in a power chair, and he had been a night charge nurse with a red pen. She had said, "The person the chart belongs to deserves the questions to be asked," and then she had looked at him like she believed that applied to people as well as medical records. He had let himself believe it. What Reed gave Margit was the thing she had needed since the accident and had been unable to name: a witness. Not a provider, not a specialist, not a manager of her expectations, a person who had read the whole chart, not just the summary, and who had looked at the full picture without deciding in advance what it meant. He had not treated her injury as the most interesting thing about her. He had not treated her recovery as the most important thing about her. He had treated her as a person who had information worth attending to, and a mind worth engaging with, and a chart worth reading all the way through. She had spent 14 months being looked at by people who were looking for the data they needed. He had looked for what was actually there. What Margit gave Reed was not rescue. She had not saved him from anything. What she had given him was the thing he had been building toward without knowing it, a use for the specificity he'd developed since Fiona, the precision that had grown from grief, the red pen habit that had made him someone who asked for reasons rather than accepting answers. She had given him a place to put the 10 years of being thorough in the dark. What Reed gave Margit was the thing she had needed since the accident, someone who looked at the chart and saw her, not a clinical category, not a case to be managed. A person whose information deserved to be read in full, whose marginal notes deserved to be followed up on, whose query for functional assessment deserved to happen when she was stable. She had been stable. He had done the assessment. Penny understood this before either of them said it, because she was 6 and had not yet learned to make simple things complicated. She had walked into a neurorehabilitation ward and drawn what she saw, a figure going fast around the corner in motion, alive in the world, and had given it away because she understood that some images belonged to the person they captured. The drawing was still on the windowsill in Margot's apartment. A figure in a chair going fast, seen from above by a child who found the angle interesting. Signed in the bottom right corner, P. Calloway. The chart was there too. Her chart, the one with the red pen annotations, framed now in a simple frame that Reed had given her when the pilot launched. 6 words in red pen, the question that had asked for precision rather than accepting shorthand. Why artifact and not signal, quantify? The question that had changed the map. This is the thing worth holding onto if this story is worth anything at all. The map is not the territory. The diagnosis is not the person. The category is not the life. 14 specialists had looked at Margot Solis' chart and seen what they expected to find. The 15th had looked at it and seen what was actually there. And the difference, that small, specific difference between looking for the expected and looking for the true, had changed everything. He had not done it because he was a hero. He had done it because his wife had been missed for 14 months, and he had learned at the cost of everything what happened when the chart was read without the question. He had decided he would ask the question, every time, for every patient, for as long as he was reading charts. He had been reading Margot's chart since February. He had been reading it the right way. And she had been, without knowing it, the person the question was always going to find.